The air hung heavy, neither alive nor dead, just suspended, waiting. The guns had fallen silent, but their echoes still trembled in the mud, as if the earth itself remembered the violence. Smoke drifted lazily through the hollowed trenches, curling like ghosts with nowhere left to haunt. Every shape was blurred, the trees stripped bare, the helmets caked in earth, the men frozen between disbelief and breath. It was not victory that filled the air, but something quieter, stranger, the deep exhale of exhaustion shared by both sides. You could hear small things again, the shuffle of boots sinking into wet clay, the distant drip of water from torn sandbags. Somewhere, a man coughed, and it sounded like the only human sound left in the world. The battlefield, moments ago a storm of metal and thunder, now lay under a blanket of uneasy peace. Even the wind moved carefully, as though afraid to disturb the wounded silence. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been screamed through smoke and loss. The British soldiers sat against the trench wall, their faces streaked with grime, eyes hollow but alive. Across the mist, shadows of German figures were still, watching, not enemies for a breath, just men trapped in the same pause of time. Between them stretched a wasteland of craters and shattered gear, but beneath it all pulsed something fragile and familiar. The silence was not peace, not yet. It was only the breath between two storms. But within that fragile breath, something ancient stirred, the faint recognition that even amid ruin, the human heart still knows how to rest. They no longer looked like soldiers. The sharp lines of uniform and rank had blurred into the same weary posture, heads bowed, shoulders slumped, hands trembling from the weight of hours without meaning. Mud clung to every surface of their bodies, turning khaki and gray into the same dull color of earth. The faces that once carried certainty were now hidden behind streaks of dirt, half lit by the muted glow of a cold morning. From a distance, one could not tell who was British and who was German. They were silhouettes, silhouettes of survival, breathing quietly in the aftermath of fury. Some leaned against their rifles like crutches, not out of readiness, but from the need to stand. Others sat motionless, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if trying to remember why they had come here at all. The front had stripped them bare, not of clothing, but of conviction. Ideologies seemed distant now, like words shouted from a shore long vanished in mist. What remained were bodies that ached the same, stomachs that tightened from hunger the same, hearts that longed for the same silence to last just a little longer. In that fragile stillness, they were no longer bound by flags or slogans. They were just men, tired, unshaven, soaked and trembling beneath the same gray sky. The battlefield had equalized them, sculpting all difference into one shared outline of endurance. Even their shadows merged on the ground, crossing and blending until one could not tell where an enemy's darkness ended and a friend's began. And though the moment was wordless, its truth was immense. Before the machinery of war, all men eventually kneel to the same exhaustion. A single cigarette might bridge the divide. Someone would toss one across, wrapped in paper. It often began without a word, just a pause held a little longer than usual. A head lifted above the trench line, not in defiance, but in weary curiosity. Across the broken earth, another head did the same. Between them, the air thickened with something uncertain. Not courage, not surrender, but the simple ache of men who had forgotten what safety felt like. Fingers tightened around triggers, not to fire, but to hold on to a familiar comfort.
The quiet was alive with the trembling question, would the other shoot first? Inches of mud became miles of hesitation. A British soldier might raise a hand, slow and visible, the palm open, the smallest gesture of humanity amid ruin.
Trembling goodwill. Laughter would follow, awkward, fragile, disbelieving. It was not peace. It was the body's rebellion against endless fear. Step by careful step, man rose from the trenches, boots sinking into the same cold soil, the distance between them shrinking with every breath. For a few moments, the front transformed, no longer a line of division, but a thin, living thread of trust stretched across mud and memory. Each heartbeat carried risk. Each glance was a negotiation between terror and hope. Yet something ancient guided them, the instinct that even in war, the soul knows when it has had enough.
Across the Western Front, these moments were not isolated miracles, but quiet patterns of human defiance, scattered like fragile stars in a night of endless fire. Reports spoke of brief truces where men, waist-deep in mud, dared to step into no man's land without rifles. They exchanged cigarettes, bread, or simply glances that said more than words ever could. The most remembered of these was the Christmas truce of 1914, when songs drifted across the trenches, Stille Nacht answered by Silent Night, and for a few trembling hours, soldiers on both sides remembered that they were sons, brothers, lovers, not merely uniforms. But beyond Christmas, smaller, unrecorded truces continued to flicker into being. Sometimes it was to collect the wounded, sometimes to bury the dead. Other times it was simply to rest. No orders permitted it. No generals planned it. It was the battlefield itself, too heavy with grief, that demanded these pauses. Men would look across the blasted landscape and realize that even the enemy shared the same dirt beneath his nails, the same ache in his bones.
Letters sent home spoke of these strange interludes with a kind of reverent disbelief. "We met them," one British soldier wrote, "and they looked just like us, only in different coats." The newspapers later softened or silenced such stories, fearing they might weaken resolve. Yet the truth persisted in memory. These fragile oases of peace whispered that beneath the machinery of empire, humanity still flickered, stubborn and alive. And when the guns resumed, those who had stood face to face across the void carried something unspoken within them, a small, private knowing that even in a war meant to divide the world, the human heart occasionally found a way to refuse. They came forward slowly, their hands raised not from fear, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. The Germans, pale beneath the grime, moved in small groups across the churned earth toward the British lines. No one shouted, no one aimed. The moment had already stripped away every trace of ceremony. A British sergeant gestured them closer with a weary nod, his rifle hanging loose at his side. It was not conquest that
The prisoners' boots squelched through the mud, their eyes lowered, faces hollowed by hunger and sleeplessness. The British watched them in silence, their own exhaustion mirrored back through the trembling steps of their captives. What had once been enemies were now reflections, two halves of the same burden. The procedure of capture unfolded almost gently. Hands searched for weapons, names were taken, water was offered. A few soldiers exchanged glances that said more than words could, a recognition that this was no victory, only the next moment to survive. Hatred had dissolved somewhere between the trenches and the morning fog. What remained was a quiet respect born of shared suffering. The British did not cheer, and the Germans did not plead. They simply moved together toward the rear lines, their boots marking the same rhythm on the broken path. In that slow procession, war felt smaller than it ever had before, like a game the world had outgrown overnight.
Up close, the Germans looked nothing like the specters described in propaganda. They were boys in torn coats, men whose cheeks had sunk into sharp angles from too many nights without warmth. Their hands shook as they walked, not from fear, but from sheer depletion, the body's quiet protest against hunger and cold. Some still clutched small tokens from home, a letter folded too many times, a photograph sealed in grime, a button polished by nervous thumbs. The British soldiers noticed these details, and something in them softened. When one prisoner stumbled, a British private instinctively reached out to steady him. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, two men equally hollow, equally human. No words passed between them, only a faint nod, as if they both understood the futility of all that had brought them there. A few prisoners whispered among themselves in broken English, thanking their captors for water, for patience. The sound was fragile, almost apologetic. They shared cigarettes, a moment's warmth in the cold air. Smoke drifted upward, mingling above them like a fragile truce written in air. One soldier offered a crust of bread from his pocket. The German hesitated, then accepted with both hands. It was such a small act, yet it felt enormous, as if the entire weight of the war had paused for that gesture to exist. In that quiet exchange, the idea of enemy disintegrated completely. They were not conquerors or captives anymore, only men sustained by the same trembling hope that somewhere beyond the trenches, life still waited. It began almost shyly, as if kindness needed permission to exist. The British soldiers sat in a rough circle near the edge of a crater, steam from their tin cups rising into the chill. A few of the German prisoners lingered nearby, silent and uncertain, their faces caught between pride and need. One British corporal tore a piece of hard biscuit in half and held it out wordlessly. For a moment, nothing happened, just the steady drift of smoke, the muted hum of flies, and the sound of distant wind sliding over the battlefield's emptiness. Then, one German reached forward, slowly, hesitantly, and took the offering with both hands. That single exchange seemed to open a door the war had tried to keep locked. Soon, others followed, a crust of bread, a bit of tinned meat, even a few precious spoonfuls of tea shared between shaking hands. There was no ceremony to it, no words of reconciliation, just the quiet rhythm of people rediscovering what it meant to care. Some laughed softly when they realized how quickly hunger overruled suspicion. Others simply watched, eyes glistening with something too deep to name. In the gray light, it was hard to tell who was feeding whom. A British private, barely 20, pushed his entire ration toward a German older than his own father. The man muttered a prayer under his breath. For a long while, the Germans simply stared at the food in their hands, as if afraid it might vanish. The hard crusts, the faintly sweet tea, even the dull gray stew seemed impossibly rich after weeks of hunger. Some tried to speak, "Danke," thank you, but the words caught in their throats, choked by disbelief. It was not just the food that moved them. It was the strangeness of being cared for by the very men they had been taught to kill. Their eyes darted from face to face, searching for cruelty, for mockery, and finding none, only the same fatigue, the same hollow gentleness. One prisoner lifted his tin cup toward a British soldier in silent salute.
The soldier hesitated, then nodded, returning the gesture. Around them, others followed, the sound of clinking metal faint and awkward, but filled with reverence. For a few minutes, conversation flickered in broken fragments, scraps of German, rough English, laughter that surprised everyone when it escaped. The guards forgot to stand guard, the captives forgot to feel captive. They simply existed in a strange, fragile equality.
Then, gradually, the noise faded into silence. Not the tense quiet of battle, but something deeper. The stillness of men realizing they had seen each other clearly for the first time. The wind carried the smell of smoke and stew and wet earth. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Gratitude moved wordlessly between them, a pulse beneath the surface of exhaustion. In that silence, it was hard to imagine that the war would ever resume. It felt for a heartbeat, as though the front itself had exhaled, surrendering not to an army, but to the fragile mercy of human recognition. It started with a cigarette, a small, glowing peace offering passed from one trembling hand to another. Smoke rose between them, like a fragile banner, curling softly in the damp air. They stood close now, British and German alike, their boots sinking into the same mud, their laughter hesitant, unsure if it was allowed.
Soon, more cigarettes followed. Someone found a tin of matches. Another shared a strip of chocolate, its sweetness dividing evenly between enemies who no longer felt like enemies. One soldier traced a photo in his hand, a wife, a baby, and passed it across. The German who received it nodded, reaching into his coat to show a picture of his own family, faces blurred from where. They did not speak the same language, but their gestures said everything. We both belong somewhere else. Laughter began to ripple through the group, quiet, shy at first, then fuller, warmer. It wasn't the laughter of joy, but of disbelief. Like men waking from a long nightmare and finding the world still soft beneath their fingers. For that brief interlude, the front line dissolved. No trenches, no orders, no sides. Only men with stories, shared in fragments, carried by smoke and the faint rhythm of their hearts slowing to something human again. But even as they smiled, they seemed to know how temporary it was, that this was a bridge made of breath, not stone. And still they crossed it, because in that moment, crossing felt like remembering what it meant to be human. Years later, the diaries would resurface, pages browned by time, the ink faded but steady. One British private had written, "We gave them cigarettes, and they smiled like schoolboys. For a while we forgot who we were supposed to be." His handwriting trembled where the pen had caught on the damp paper, as if even memory itself hesitated to believe what it had seen. Another account described the Germans' quiet gratitude, how they ate carefully, almost reverently, as though each bite might break the spell. A German soldier, whose notebook was found decades later, recorded the same day from the other side. "The English shared with us their bread and warmth," he wrote. "It was the first time since the war began that I felt like a man again." His words carried no bitterness, only awe, a childlike disbelief that kindness could exist in such a place. These fragments of testimony, scattered through letters and journals, gave texture to the myth. They were not legends of heroism or victory, but of stillness, proof that even the mud of the front could yield something pure. Historians would later read these passages aloud in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the fragile magic of that day. The ink, the paper, the trembling words all seemed to whisper the same quiet revelation. The enemy was never the man across the field, but the silence between hearts. And so, those written traces became more than records. They were echoes of a moment when men remembered themselves. Words that once bled on wet pages still breathe, reminding us that even amid history's noise, compassion leaves the deepest mark. The order came quietly, almost apologetically, as if even command feared breaking the fragile spell. A whistle pierced the air, sharp, official, cold. The laughter stilled at once. Cigarettes were dropped, half-smoked, into the mud. The men stood awkwardly, as though waking from a shared dream they didn't quite want to end. Across the field, the Germans straightened too, reading the same signal in the body language of their captors. For a heartbeat, neither side moved. Then, slowly, the machinery of war began to breathe again.
Engines rumbled in the distance. A faint crack of artillery echoed from somewhere unseen. The men exchanged one last look, a nod, a faint smile, a wave, gestures too small to belong in a world that demanded uniformity. Then they turned away, each to his own line, swallowed once more by the duties that defined them. The air felt heavier, as though it grieved the return of command. The stillness that had held them together shattered beneath the rhythm of boots and orders. Helmets were adjusted, rifles lifted. It was astonishing how easily habit reasserted itself, how the uniforms reassembled the illusion of difference. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Each man carried a quiet defiance in his chest, the memory of warmth, of bread, of laughter, all fragile proof that for a fleeting hour the world had been sane. In the weeks that followed, the war reclaimed every inch of ground that kindness had touched. The same men who once shared bread and laughter now crouched again behind the barrels of guns, obeying orders that made sense only on paper. Yet somewhere inside, a small ember memory refused to die. The meal, that quiet communion in the mud, lingered like a secret too sacred to speak aloud. When rations were low, or nights impossibly long, someone might glance across the field and wonder if the man in the opposite trench remembered too.
Letters home began to carry traces of it, though veiled in careful language. It wasn't all horror, one British soldier wrote. For a moment, we were simply men again. The words were brief, almost hidden, as if the truth had to be smuggled past censors and time alike. On both sides, men would later admit that the memory followed them into the next battles, into hospitals, even into old age. It softened their anger, confused their hatred, made the noise of war sound hollower than before. That shared meal became a private relic, carried not in pockets, but within the quiet corners of conscience. It reminded them that beneath every uniform beat the same fragile rhythm of life: hunger, warmth, exhaustion, mercy. And though the war demanded obedience, the heart remembered rebellion, that for one impossible moment, compassion had dared to exist where it should not. When they fought again, it was not quite the same. Somewhere between the thunder and the silence, a whisper remained. We have seen each other's humanity once. We can never unsee it.
In the great machinery of history, that shared meal might seem small, a footnote between battles, a pause between tragedies. yet it carried the weight of everything humanity strives to remember. In a world torn by flags and fear, a few weary men proved that empathy needs no uniform, no anthem, no permission. That moment, simple as bread passed from one hand to another, became something timeless, the soul recognizing itself across the line of war. They had not planned it, nor did they seek to be noble. Compassion had emerged not from glory, but from exhaustion, from the quiet collapse of hatred under the sheer burden of survival. It was an act too humble for headlines, yet too profound to die. In that fragile communion, the illusion of sides dissolved, and for an instant they stood on common ground that neither empire could claim. The gesture said what history so often forgets, that kindness does not need victory to matter. It exists in the smallest defiance, a crust of bread, a shared glance, a breath spared. In that, the soldiers found something greater than orders, a brief, shining truth that humanity, even in ruin, still knows how to reach for itself.
Evening settled over the scarred fields, washing the trenches in muted gold. The last smoke from campfires drifted upward, blending with the slow-moving mist, until earth and sky became the same soft gray. Somewhere, a distant gun fired, a lonely echo, swallowed quickly by distance. The men were gone now, scattered by duty and time, but the place still seemed to hum with their memory. If you listened closely, you could almost hear it, faint laughter carried on the wind, the ghost of shared warmth lingering between the ridges of mud. The light dimmed, and with it the world seemed to sigh. The battlefield, once alive with fury, exhaled into peace. In that fading glow, the story found its rest, not in triumph or defeat, but in the quiet dignity of remembrance. The war moved on, but the brotherhood remained, suspended forever in the tender hush of twilight.